protection of children. Without any further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister for making your speech within 7 minutes. Here.
Mr. Speaker, in order to have this debate, we have to recognize what kind of society that we live in right now, what kind of situation children are in, and what kind of norms we have when it comes to children. We are no longer at an age where children are rampantly abused by their parents, were rampantly sexually abused by their teacher, etc., etc. We already have things such as existing legislation to protect children. We have minimal social pressures and minimal social expectation to parents in not doing those kind of things. The kind of harm that we recognize from the opening government is a norm of overprotection of children. Overprotection and this over prioritization and over expectation that is which is severely imposed upon the parents, and that is the kind of a social expectation that the opening government is proud to oppose. So the definition will go as follows. We regret the increasing social expectation and societal norms towards overprotections of children's well-being. So we oppose defining for things such as particular norms about how to raise children, or how not to raise children, and how to protect children, etc., etc. We are more than happy to support things such as existing laws against child abuse law, child protection law, and we are okay with having individual expectations, like parents on themselves having expectation for having certain methods of how raising their children, families having their own expectation and having their own methodology and how they raise their children. We think that those kind of individual expectation is completely different from a societal expectation, which can be very enforceable. So I'm going to talk about 3 issues in today's debate. First of all, I'm going to briefly talk about why the societal expectation of overprotection of children is increasing and rampant in the status quo. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why is the norm of overprotection necessarily harmful. And third of all, I'm going to talk about what happens in a world without social expectation. Yes?
Okay, so minimum social protection you talked in the introduction is in the past was considered was overprotection. But this increasing social expectation actually changes through this process.
That is exactly the case, and we no longer think that we are living in a status quo in which these kind of minimal or these kind of severe social expectation is necessarily required, because when you see objectively, children's well-being are protected. So briefly, let's talk about why we think that overprotection is the current norm. I give you 2 reasons why. First of all, because we think there are many legislation which are oftentimes passed in liberal democracies which are at the fringe of overprotection of children. For example, banning private teachings and the state necessarily intervening within the teachings which happens in the schools. But moreover, we think that this kind of societal pressure is necessarily created when things such as with the existence of media, when particular types of parenting, when particular types of parent expectation is necessarily propagated through things such as the media or the social networking system. We think that what we have as a society is a society in which we have one particular type of parenting which is good, and we think this is necessarily harmful. So that is the kind of context that we're in, when we have a society defining parenting, and oftentimes that a social pressure is becoming enforcing against a child. So why, in that paradigm, why do we think the norm of overprotection is necessarily harmful? I'm going to take a look at this harm in 2 aspects, in terms of the children and in terms of the parents. So let's first of all talk about the harms to the children. There's 2 harms to the children. First of all, when you have an increased norm of overprotection that necessarily actually harms and necessarily harms the children's well-being. For example, societal, the reason why that's the case is because societal pressure towards parents, right? There's many peer pressure amongst the parents themselves to necessarily protect their children and teach their children and raise their children in a particular way. What happens as a consequence of that is a situation of things such as tiger parenting, ladies and gentlemen, because parents necessarily think that it is an expectation, and they severely have this expectation impose this expectation on themselves. Why do we think that things such as tiger parenting is bad? It is oftentimes bad because since parents have like a lot of expectation to the children, that oftentimes leads to a situation where parents have too much pressure on their children. For example, force them to cram school, or force them on like unrealistic expectation of their children, and this can actually be a harm to the children because this can also become a psychological pressure to the children as well. So even if like children are protected in terms of well-being, like oftentimes lead to a situation where they have decreased self-esteem, etc., etc. The second harm to the children is the harm to children's individuality. When we think that in order to develop individual characteristic, various experience is a fundamental necessity in life, and we think that risk against danger is a fundamental inevitability that individuals necessarily have to experience in life to have these various characteristics. But the problem with the status quo is that since parents are too overprotective of their children, it creates a situation in which you have like instruments in children's playing ground be limited. Like how children can use playground is necessarily limited. Or you have many parents not letting their children play outside and let them play inside their home and play video games, etc., because they're too afraid that their children might become in an accident, ladies and gentlemen. As a consequence of that, it necessarily undermines children's capacity to experience various things, therefore undermining the development of various independent characteristics. We think that's a harm to the children's well-being as well. But thirdly, in terms of parents, we think this also harms the parents, because at the same time we're seeing increasing norm of overprotection and social expectation of overprotection. At the same time we're also seeing societal phenomena such as nuclear family, and that parents necessarily don't have other people to give them advice on how to raise their parents. So at the same time, the parents' capacity to raise their children properly is decreasing because they don't have advisors such as their own parents. The societal expectation, at the other hand, is actually increasing at the other hand. So this necessarily creates a situation where you severely burden the parents, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's bad because when you severely pressurize the parents, it creates a situation where parents also have decreased self-esteem. They think that they're bad parents, ladies and gentlemen, because they cannot meet the social expectation. It leads to a situation where parents are severely depressed. It oftentimes leads to a situation where parents will oftentimes go after their children, like abuse their children, because they feel that they're very bad parents. So finally, what would happen in a world without social expectation? Like, we think that the problem in the status quo is that society is defining particular type of parenting, particular type of how to raising their children as a definitive and a good way of parenting, and that is necessarily imposed upon their parents. What happens, and what is the ideal world in our situation, is that individual parents or individual family are able to construct their own way of parenting, ladies and gentlemen. And we think this is ultimately better because ultimately family situation is different from like family to family. How to raise their family is like what is best to raise their children and families is necessarily different from better than better. So we think that it is utterly wrong for society to have a particular definition of how to raise their children when how to raise their children is fundamentally differ from individual to individual. Ladies and gentlemen, the opening government opposed overprotection of children not only because it harms the parents but also it harms the children's well-being. We are very proud of it.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister. Next, I want to read out the question. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, we completely deny the types of harm coming from opening government because there is a certain type of reason why that kind of expectation happens. And we say the harm that's existing, for example, the reason why the instruments are actually excluded from the playground or those kind of things is something necessary. That is the reason why we actually put those kind of instruments away. And we say as long as we have to recognize the circumstances we live in or the circumstances that children are faced completely differs between time to time. We have to recognize the necessity of the increase of social expectation. We say that's the clear stance we support from today's organization. But basically what we are going to do today, what I'm going to do from leader opposition is completely, firstly, deny the characterization of what kind of social pressure which is happening. We say that these kind of things is actually practically based on, for example, the necessity what the society really needs. Secondly, I'd like to talk about why actually the increase is necessary when we actually focus on the structure of the decision-making process if there's no social expectation, or what those will be included in my speech. So moving to the first issue, what kind of protection we want to achieve. So the premise of opening government today is that the type of social expectation happening under the state at school is extremely radical. But we have to recognize, from whose perspective this is radical, which that side of house never explained. The first characterization we bring to you today is that this kind of demand is always based on a necessity, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, foremost, is that because the parents are always the best assessor of what the children need in the first place. For example, the parents have spent so much time compared to any kind of actor, for example, the teachers or the PTA or those kind of other decision-making actors which that side will have want to achieve. In this sense, you have to recognize that the parents are actually have enough curriculum to decide what kind of protection is necessary. Secondly, you have to recognize that children can actually much more voice out based to the parents or those kind of actors that give social protection much more better than the teachers or other actors. In this sense, you have to recognize, for example, the parents' pressure, for example, to the PTA or the parents voicing out to the media is actually based on the rational criteria, based on the actual demand of what the children need or what the kind of protection we need. Now, thank you. But even if we concede to a certain extent that these kind of demands may be objectively excessive to a certain extent, we say that situation is much more better. Because you have to recognize to a certain extent, for example, the parents or those kind of actors has no incentive to outsource the type of protection to the third party to the minimum extent. They always have the incentive to actually They always have the incentive to actually, they always have the incentive to outsource the minimum extent of social protection to the society, Mr. Speaker. For example, the type of crime, for example, the patrolling from the children on the way from home to school is extremely much more beneficial for the children to a certain extent in this scenario. In this sense, even if we concede to a certain extent the demand is excessive, as long as children are the most vulnerable actor, and as long as the parents have no incentive to outsource something which is necessary only to the minimum extent, we say that situation is better. Yes, sir.
As what you say is true, if parents are perfect actor when it comes to raising their child, why do we have to have a society defining particular parenting to impose upon the parents?
Okay, first and foremost, the increasing social expectation and defining what kind of way to grow up the children is completely a different matter. Because we already have, for example, diverse ways or diverse spectrums of how to grow up their children. For example, there are, for example, parents that actually only educate their children, for example, to school, but maybe only on studying, but maybe balance out between their parents that balance out, for example, studying and, for example, sporting. We say that there's many kind of, for example, famous, for example, actresses or famous entertainers explaining their own original way of how to develop their children. We don't think that the norm creation harm coming up from opening government is extremely unrealistic. Moving to the second issue, why the increase of necessary incentive, why the increase of social expectation is necessary in order to incentivize the responsible actors existing in the society. You have to recognize that who is going to decide what kind of protection is going to be provided to the children. For example, the PTA, for example, the public schools, for example, maybe the media in this sense. For example, we focus on 20 or 30 years ago, there was extreme corporal punishment from the teachers to the parents because the society had because of the lack of the expectation toward no, thank you. Because of the lack of social expectation to the protection of the children. For example, the educational committee, for example, the PTA, we decide what kind of protection should be given to the children. It's actually, for example, composed of, for example, elderly people, for example, the formal teachers whose value is extremely outdated from 20, not the current norm, but for example, 20 to 30 years ago. In this sense, these kind of actors can never ever reflect what kind of things are necessary without the existence of the social expectation. But for example, when we focus on the incentive, for example, the teachers, when we focus on the public schools, as long as they have public servants, they have no active incentive to actually actively move to actually take the children without the pressure of the society, without the pressure, without having to deal with the attention to actually deal with the society's pressure in this. In this sense, you have to recognize that thanks to these because of the lack of these kind of things. For example, we used to see, for example, so many kinds of corporal punishment. For example, so many young children, for example, actually recruited by the gang criminal organization or the gang organization, we say this situation without the increase is actually much more harmful. But we think we can actually minimize that because thanks to the increase of the social expectation. Because the society actually pressurizes these kind of extremely inclusive communities to actually move towards these kind of things. For example, we focus on the corporal punishment. First, we can actually decrease the number. We can pressurize teachers to actually give an eye to many children to actually prevent the corporal punishment. But even if the corporal punishment actually somehow happen, we can, for example, provide counseling to actually deal with the mental fear that these kind of children is actually achieved. We think we can achieve these kind of things thanks to the existence of the increase of the social pressure in this sense, because these kind of actors will never ever move without the existence of the social expression. We think, for example, even in the case of criminal organization, as long as the society already, because the society recognizes that the current gang organization is extremely bad thing, and the youth is actually easily tend to go into this kind of gang organization, we can actually prevent that by actually pressurizing these kind of things, utilizing society's power in this sense. So what have we brought you today from opening motion? First and foremost, we completely deny the characterization of what kind of information these kind of societal expectations is composed of. Secondly, we explain to you why the increase is necessary for all these extreme problems.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Next, I call up the second speaker from the Africa. Okay. 2 points of clarification from the deputy. First of all, we don't know whether social pressure is strong to the extent that social pressure pressurizes the parents to behave in a certain way, or parents have the ability or capability to oppose those external factors. I don't know what kind of characters you are talking about. Parents are strong or social pressure is strong, which is the legitimate characterization. We believe on our side of the house, we believe the current social pressure is too extreme and too strong. That's why we remove that in order to empower parents to diversify the ways in which they raise up their children. Second of all, there's always legitimate reason for the existence of social expectation like a necessity. The question on this side of the house is who's creating that reason? We believe majoritarian, historically constructive narrative is not universal. There are some parents who have different ideas, who have some children that have different characteristics from majoritarian acceptance or expected values. That's the kind of values that we would like to defend on our side of the house. 3 rebuttals to their side of the house. First of all, their first argument is, parents are so capable to oppose PTA, then change the society. If parents are so capable of changing society, why do we have to have social expectation in the first place? That contradicts their third argument, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. If the answer, that's my partner actually pointed out during the point of information, the answer from their side of the house is we have a diverse spectrum, right? That kind of diverse spectrum is far more achievable and feasible on our side of the house when parents are free from socially dominant narrative on how parents should actually behave, right? With the absence of dominant conception of ideal model, parents are more able to diversify their parenting model on our side of the house. That's why we oppose and regulate the social expectation, which means current dominant one type of particular ideal model of parenting model is particularly harmful, right? We are happy to remove those external factors. Second of all, they say, reasonable actors, they can incentivize reasonable actors because those who have old-fashioned idea need to reflect the current changing social values. That's contradictory to their arguments, right? Because if they support that kind of diverse spectrum, then why do we have to have the social pressurization, which is imposing one conception that's fundamentally antithetical to the kind of the value that they defend on their side of the house. If they want to defend the spectrum or the multiplicity of values, they don't have to have social expectation that is imposing one particular ideologies upon the individuals. Moving on to my final clash point, including all the rebuttals. I will go.
So recognizing what kind of protection or what kind of things is necessary for the children, how can you, under your paradigm, you can achieve that without the existence of a social expectation?
Like my partner pointed out, we don't oppose basic legislation to protect children from crimes or abuse or sexual harassment. That's the kind of things that we call social expectation. We are talking about more additional social expectation that society necessarily embraces. That's why I'm going to explain my final argument. What's the nature of social expectation, unlike individual expectation a family has? Social expectation is oftentimes very coercive, and the definition of what is socially good is historically constructed, that's fictionally, that's illusionary. Because majoritarianism can oftentimes define the ways in which children or parents behave in an ideal manner. We believe majority opt in that and cater to those basic social structure that were established upon the fact that majority at that particular time in history believe in that. For example, this conception is installed into public education system or like entrance exam like the AO system of private institution in Japan, like usually awarded by Ministry of Education, like academic ability we're talking about, or the ability or physical ability, but those conventionally valued ability is what we call social expectation. However, this is unduly marginalized children who have different characteristics. Why is that? Three kinds of harm we see on this side of the house. First of all, it undermines social progress of democracy, because democracy is about different kinds of values that are fairly valued by society. Certain ability happen to be valued by people at this particular moment. For example, physical ability or academic ability happen to be valued by society at this particular moment in the society. But we believe this is a random and arbitrary. Maybe personality or kindness or coolness or different aspects of individuality may be valued by society in the future. But this kind of social progress is undermined when one particular value is accepted as good. We oppose this kind of dichotomy between good and bad. We believe, ability that people have or characteristics people have is not necessarily about good or bad, and this kind of binary polarization. No, thank you. Second of all, it undermines and marginalizes a minority who have different characteristics. Oftentimes, rich families have the ability to send their children to private schools or cram school in order to financially empower those children. But this is a matter of birth lottery. Those who don't have financial capability do not have any chance and opportunity to raise and focus upon necessary ability the society recognizes. Like academic ability, they don't have capacity to send their children to expensive cram school or private institution or private educational school, which is so unfair because that undermines the entrenches the absence of social mobility in society. Closing.
Can you separate the social expectation from individual expectation after all, because the social society is composed by individuals?
No, yes, because if we don't have any majoritarian definition of what is good and what is bad, if we don't have this kind of binary polarization in society, we are more than happy to enable individual family to construct their own ideology, just like Benito school, just like a religious school, just like a homeschooling, whatever kind of different school which is antithetical to majoritarian value that we have in society. Finally, it incentivizes antisocial behavior because the only mechanism for children to oppose social value is to resort to the violent behavior, unlike intelligent discourse. That's how Ozaki Yutaka glorified in his songs, talking about necessity and glorification of those methods to oppose social values. We believe this is very harmful because the only way for children to oppose social value is to resort to violent mechanism. It undermines social binary polarization, which increases the stigma upon those individuals who have different capability from what society actually expects them to behave. We believe the concept of a social expectation is fragile, that is very randomly constructed by society historically, which is so unfair for minority or the marginalized individual who have different characteristics but still should be valued and awarded by society in a fair manner. That's why we oppose. Thank you.
Okay, I think if you publish the next icon from the same spec across the opening competition. Okay.
So the final argument from opening comment is how increasing social expectations is actually necessary to meet the changing need with regards to the protection of the children. Because the premise of opening comment is because there is there is like the minimum amount of the protection. That's enough. But researchers' important observation from the opening operation is this definition of the minimum protection gonna be changing through the decades. That is why we need increasing, like the moving social expectation to meet these demands. This is the clarification, and this is the substantial my point. But before that, actually 2 points of rebuttal to the cases. Firstly, they talked about how, because this kind of social expectation actually stop the social progress, that is why as a consequence of that, the children have to resort to violent behavior to oppose these, like the social progress. To respond to that, firstly, researcher, this is very unrealistic, right? If you are a child, you have various ways to oppose these social expectations. For example, if you are so opposing to the going to the private school, you can, for example, cancel themselves, right? You are always able to do that. And secondly, the important observation from outside of the house, if these children have idea of opposing this particular time of expectations, after you grow up as adults, you can actually make the social expectation themselves in order to counter the old-fashioned expectation, researcher. That is why if you're growing up to the adult, you are able at least to make the other counter social expectation to this particular form of expectation. That is why we don't think this is a problem of opening garment. And secondly, not yet. Secondly, they talked about how social expectation is always too strong for the parents to be forced to force. Couple responses. The first thing is that these social expectations is actually created by the parents, right? Because parents are most actors who care a lot for the children. That is why if you take their logic, the parents are forced to parents to follow their parents' norm, right? This is unrealistic in the first place. Then they say because the parents have diverse value or different types of perception, the parents have to be free from these social expectations because majority creates a coercive norm. Two responses to that. Firstly, Mr. Chair, we also agree parents have the diverse expectation. That is why our proposal can work. Because the parents have different perspective. The parents create a different increasing social expectation to the responsible body, right? For example, some parents demand the educational protection, like the more class for the English. But some other parents, for example, demand the physical protection, for example, patrolling around the school, right? That is why because the diverse opinion actually exists among the parents can create this different increasing social expectation. We think this is a good thing. And secondly, although the majority actually creating these social expectations, because majority cares the majority's demand, majority never do wrong to the majority, right? Because the majority actually the one who are creating the social expectation. They are in favor to their opinion itself. That is why as a consequence of this, the majority actually benefited to this social expectation. That is why, although the majority actually coercively created, even if we take this logic, this coercive expectation is not bursting as the consequence of this policy opening.
Your partner said that that corporal punishment is something which is bad, but in certain conservative community, using corporal punishment, beating your child to be straight, is actually the expectation of those communities. Do you agree that in these communities, social expectation is something bad?
Okay, so a couple of responses. Firstly, if the conservative conservative community believe even the status quo, like corporal punishment is a good thing. This is actually contradictory to their idea, right? Because they themselves say there is a minimum amount of the protection. I don't know which is true scenario on the opening garment. And secondly, this is actually my substandard, so please wait for that. So the my substandard is going to be how the increasing expectation is actually necessary to meet the changing needs with regards to the protection of the child. Mr. Chair, the opening garment talks about that just because there is minimum protection existing, the expectation leads to overprotection. Mr. Chair, there are two problematic premises on this point. The first premise of this argument is minimum protection is enough even for 10 years later or 20 years or 20 years later. No, we believe necessary protection may change day by day or year by year. For example, in the past, like my partner actually said, the expectation actually changed the incentive of the school to avoid the corporal punishment, which was actually regarded as a legitimate way of the education. Or even in the status quo, for example, as the LGBT rights movement actually have been recognized through the history, we believe their social expectation demand through the establishment of the LGBT school to protect LGBT students. That is why recognize this example. We believe the expectation or actually demand are changing day by day. That is why we need increasing social expectation, even if this is the form of the coerce as opening government characterized. The second premise their argument are based on is like this overprotection is always bad thing as a consequence. But no, Mr. Chair, for example of tiger parents. Yes, we believe the way of tiger parents is actively coerced in some occasion. But let's look at outcome, right? Because these children actually forced to study, they have good outcome to good university, for example. Or they talked about nuclear family. But it is also a good thing because the budget for the education gotta be not shared by 2 or 3 children, but actually focus on the 1 children, right? That is why this over expectation or over protection is not always bad thing. It's somehow good thing. Recognizing this overprotection is good thing, we believe our proposal is much better. Yes, we agree this increasing social expectation gonna be moved to the coercive way. But as far as the consequence is not always bad, we believe the parents have the right to create this social expectation to meet the increasing, the changing demand, right? This is the stance coming from opening opposition. Mr. Chair, the opening government argument is very straightforward, right? Because increasing social expectation exists, this can be the coercive, this can be only majority idea. But Mr. Chair, importantly, the coercive idea or majority idea is not always bad, especially to meet the changing demand in the society. In the past, the corporal punishment is actually exists, even the status quo, the LGBT school never exists. But because we have this social expectation, we can change, we can push the society to the progress we are immensely proud of us.
Okay, so here opening opposition. Next I call for the closing comment on the first speaker. Here. Today, the opening government is completely explained what is the problem in status quo. So we want to extend